in the book, so.
Yes.
Okay, whatever it is, we're out. All right.
Yeah, I noticed there.
Is it okay if I scan it so I can get it?
Lots have changed. Lots has changed. What are you doing?
Well, good morning. I guess I'm going to go first. My name is Sherri Mitchell. I'm a Penobscot tribal member. I'm also an attorney. I do indigenous rights work, a lot of land protection work, sacred sites protection, and right now asserting natural rights, earth rights into code so that we can really define where we're moving. I'm from the state of Maine. I do a lot of work around the United States, but I also do some work in Canada. And where there's a lot of things going on that should be very concerning to the people in this country. Because, as you all know, the Iguala Aquifer is drying up, the Colorado Basin is drying up, and all of the freshwater sources that are going to be left are going to be in the northeast of Canada. And so it's really important to be paying attention to what's going on there, because we don't want to be standing in line waiting for rations of water, and that's where we're headed. So some of the things that we're doing are focused on those issues, and I think that Ruth is going to talk quite a bit about water rights. Yeah, this afternoon. So if you have the opportunity to catch her session this afternoon, then I think that would be really beneficial. So I would like to talk a little bit about what we're doing. Start small and then kind of broaden it out. What we're doing is we are looking at writing constitutions that have very clearly defined boundaries for how people have to walk upon our lands. And so when we look at some of these larger issues, there's supposed to be nation-to-nation relationships between the indigenous populations, the indigenous nations, and the host governments, if you will. So between the tribes here in this country and the United States, there's supposed to be a nation-to-nation relationship. And so we're expected, when we're on U.S. territory, to follow the laws of the U.S., and we expect representatives of the U.S. to respect the laws on our own territories. And so if we want to be able to protect our lands, then we need to really have very clearly delineated boundaries on how people interact with those lands, what the relationship is that we expect with the land, based on what we see as the Creator's law or the natural law. That tells us how we live our lives in relationship to all other elements of creation. And so we're really working to put those things into some type of legal code so that people that come into our territories have to respond to the land in that same way. So where I come from, there's how many of you were in the last session? Okay, so a lot of you saw the map that I held up of Upper New England and then the Canadian Maritimes, where all of the Wabanaki people are. So the Wabanaki Confederacy is actually creating a constitution where we're thinking maybe 30 tribes and First Nations will be signing on to that constitution that defines how people have to interact with our lands, which means that we not only address fracking and tar sands and the exportation of our water, but we also address long-term impacts so that we have a plan in place for whatever they come up with next, right? So it's not just looking at the short term, stopping what's going on right now, it's looking at the long term to really define an entire relationship with the land and the water and all life, because we're all interdependent on each other. And so there are also local communities that are starting to do the same thing, that are defining within their local ordinances how people are able to interact with the land in their communities. They're starting to draft ordinances about food sovereignty, And so all of these same issues that have been spilling out of the indigenous communities are now starting to rise up in these small local pockets, which is very exciting to me. It should be exciting to everybody, because it really is about taking a step toward creating our own sovereignty. You know, not just as individuals deciding who we want to purchase products from, where we want to invest our money, how self-sufficient we want to be, what we want our footprint to be on the planet. Do we bring our own water with us, or do we buy water? You know, just simple little things like that, but expanding that into a broader scope so that, you know, not only are we doing it in our household, but we're doing it in our communities, we're doing it in our counties, we're doing it in our states, in our nations, and broadening it out. And we do have the ability to be able to do that. And so those are some of the things that we're working on, from a small scale to a large scale, creating small scale food sovereignty in our own communities by planting gardens specifically for the elder community, planting gardens for the youth, planting gardens for families, so that everybody has their own little spot, really working to secure our water sources. And then looking at it on a broader scale, looking at creating something here similar to the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. And so how many of you are familiar with that? Oh, I know that.
Is that the,
Bolivia.
Bolivia, right?
Yeah. So, you know, Bolivia passed the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, which recognizes the planet as a living being, as a living entity with rights. In the last talk that I did, I talked a little bit about the fact that as Indigenous people, we believe that our relationship with the land is indistinguishable from who we are as human beings, that we are an extension of the land is an extension of our kinship network, and that we're really reliant upon each other for our survival. And so looking at the fact that our rights to life, to health, to any type of prosperity do not originate with other people. All of those rights originate with the land, because without it we would not exist. That's a fact. You know, we can't live without basic subsistence needs being met. So that's the land and the water. And so understanding that our rights originate from the land, from the earth, gives us a clearer understanding of what we need to do in order to frame some type of protection for the land and the water, for the planet. That the planet, by virtue of, you know, its regal place in our life, right, has the right to the same type of life and health and prosperity that we're seeking for ourselves. And so writing in specific protections for the protection, long-term protection of the planet, writing in protections for future generations. I want my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren to have the same opportunity that I have to live a life of dignity, to have enough, you know, and just operating not on a sense of want and a sense of need, but a sense of having enough. And that is part of a core cultural value that is definitely germane to my culture, that we make sure that everybody has enough. It's not about this hierarchical, individualized system of wealth. It's really about community wealth, and it's about making sure that everybody has enough. And so looking at those things, that, you know, we have to ensure the ability of our future generations to carry on. And one of the things that Richard said in the last session is that, you know, we can come together and we may disagree, but eventually we'll figure it out. Well, what protection of this planet does for us is it gives us the time to figure it out. It gives us the time to disagree. And I think the one thing that we can all agree on is that we all want to survive long enough to have the opportunity to figure it out. Long enough to disagree and to argue about it and to get mad and, you know, to do all of the things that we have to do to go through our process. But where we are united is in our desire to survive. And that doesn't happen without clean drinking water. It doesn't happen for anyone. And so looking at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there are a number of provisions that are in there that provide mechanisms by which we can assert certain rights, and this document is aspirational, but there are specific things in here that are also written in a number of other international conventions and that are part of customary international law. And for instance, Article 7 and Article 20 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People gives Indigenous peoples the rights to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty, and security of person. What we're doing now and getting creative is asserting that when a corporation comes into our territory and destroys our water, or they contaminate the land so that we can't grow crops, or they're dumping uranium in our backyard so that, you know, everybody's dying from illness, that it's actually interfering with our rights under these mechanisms. And it's not just one aspirational document. There's a whole list of international mechanisms that provide us with those rights. And so really, there are a couple of test cases that are going on right now in Canada based on this, where we're really starting to assert your actions are interfering with our right to live the way that we choose to live. You're granting us subsistence rights, but you're destroying all of the elements of our subsistence. And so really going after it in that way. Another thing that we're working on, there's this big San Francisco Peaks case that's been going on forever. Are you familiar with San Francisco Peaks? Anybody? Yeah, so San Francisco Peaks is a mountain in Arizona where there are either aliens in that mountain or there's a huge store of some type of cash crop that's in there, okay? Because the US government has really stepped in to support a privately owned company, ski resort in Arizona.
Oh, I see.
Okay? Ski resort in Arizona, who has never really made any money. They fast-tracked their permitting for creating a water pipeline up there that would dump medical waste and water from mortuaries into their snowmaking machines. And so, not only are you talking about disease and endocrine blockers and all of these other things that are just such an incredibly reckless biohazard fiasco, but you're also talking about a very sacred ceremonial site for over a dozen tribes in that region. And so they're not saying, oh, you can't go on there and perform your ceremonies, but what's happening is that there are ceremonies that take place there. There's harvesting of medicinal plants and a number of ceremonies that I won't name, and those ceremonies are prohibited from taking place in an area where sickness or death has touched it. And so what they're doing is a constructive eviction of the people from that place because they're destroying the use. And so working along those lines to start addressing those issues, and again, we need an incredible amount of allies to help to move those things forward. It doesn't matter how much time they give you, you always run out. So, also looking at a number of articles again in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and in other mechanisms that both the US and Canada has legally signed on to, which they are legally bound to, even though there is no enforcement mechanism, so they have no teeth. So to give you an idea of how much respect that Canada has for the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights, James Anaya, has been requested to come to Canada. Jim is a former professor of mine from law school and actually wrote part of the UN country report on its compliance with the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights, the part on land and natural resources. And they refused his plane entry into Canada. They turned him around in Ottawa and sent him back to the United States. They would not let him enter the country in an official capacity. And so we're going to talk about the fiasco that is Canada in the Idle No More session this afternoon. But consultation issues. So consultation issues, there are binding legal obligations on both the United States and Canada to get the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples before taking any action that might negatively influence them or impact them. And so they have failed miserably. What they do is they hold listening sessions. And they listen to people, and they call that consultation. And so we're challenging that legally and really getting some clear definitions of what does consultation mean and demanding that that take place. There's a working group that's just been formed by an organization in Canada called Kairos of indigenous peoples from all over the Americas, and I'm sitting on that committee, and we're talking about a strategic plan for addressing the consultation issues. So those are some of the things that are going on right now. From my perspective, there's probably an awful lot more, but I want to respect my fellow panelists and give them an opportunity to talk about the really good work that they're doing. So thank you very much.
Greetings. So our bios are in the program. I think all I want to say is when I was living in Oswego, New York, and fighting the nuclear power plants, and my kids were in grammar school, and they said, "Mom, they want to know what our parents do. We're supposed to say." And I don't know if they've forgiven me yet, but I said, "Well, just say I'm a troublemaker." And so that's who I try to be. So what I want to do in this time is to use water as an example and to discuss both global and local initiatives, specifically, in this case, the UN resolution on the human right to water and sanitation, and also rights-based ordinance in New Hampshire, in Barnstead, New Hampshire. And I want to use this to talk about general principles around corporate power and what we need to be doing together. So I want to start with the U.S. resolution on the human right to water and sanitation. This was a big campaign by the international movement around the right to water and also fighting the global trade agreements. We have a coalition called Our World Is Not for Sale. And a lot of those folks were also involved in the fight around the right to water. And Pablo Salon, who was the UN ambassador from Bolivia and had been a part of our World Is Not for Sale network, really led, spearheaded, and was responsible for getting this UN resolution passed a few years ago. And so it felt like a big victory that this had happened. The resolution calls upon states and international organizations to provide financial resources, help capacity building and technology transfer, to help countries, in particular developing countries, to provide safe, clean, accessible, affordable drinking water and sanitation for all. And the vote in the UN was 122 in favor, no votes, 41 abstentions. So what was the US position? Abstain. Along with Canada, UK, and Korea, Poland, New Zealand, Netherlands, Sweden. You know, some of the people who should know better, but who are they really listening to? I remember when this was being worked on, you know, and I was on these international water calls, you know, trying to get language in about the corporations. Well, without going into any detail about this, the fact of the matter is the corporations have very successfully infiltrated the UN. Very, very successfully. And so, lo and behold, there was not a word in this declaration about the role of corporations. And so, you know, who was I? I could just say what I thought should be. Didn't mean it was going to happen. And so afterwards, you know, when I read it through, there were some things that really stood out for me. One thing is it never mentioned the commodification of water. Commodification being the pricing of water at a market price, right? That's what commodification is. That's what bottled water is. It's commodifying water, it's making it a market good, right? The resolution says nothing about privatization, the control of water and sewer services by the corporations. So it's absolutely silent on privatization. And when it talks about how to realize this resolution, it never acknowledges the kind of power that these corporations have here in the United States, frankly, but particularly in poor countries. And it leaves it up to the private sector to determine the actual potential harms through due diligence. Oh yeah, right. And then, just to quote from it, when non-state actors are involved in service provisions, they don't say the C word, non-state actors, not the corporate, they don't mention corporations. The obligation remains with the state to ensure that the involvement does not result in violations of the rights to sanitation and water. Adequate regulation is thus required. Now think about the governing capacity of a lot of countries. It's bad enough here where the corporations write the regulations, but at least we have a regulatory structure. Well, a lot of countries that really isn't there, and those are the countries where the corporations are particularly going in to take control under the guise of making sure there's water for all. Oh yeah, right. It also says that states must put into place supplementary social policies to ensure inclusiveness, such as safety nets and subsidies. And again, it ignores the fundamental issue of the transnational corporations being driven by profit taking. And it's assuming that these countries would be able to do this. So I ask you, have you ever heard about this resolution? Anybody? Have you, one person? Have you ever heard about what the United States is doing to comply with this? I mean, I try and keep my water antenna up there, but I've never heard one word about the U.S. trying to comply with this. And we also had the UN rapporteur on the human right to water come to this country. And one of the things, in this case, she was allowed in. She went to the Central Valley of California and did quite a report on what's going on there with the loss of clean water because of agribusiness in the Central Valley. So that there were some good parts to her report, but then where does that go? You know, where does it go? It just goes into the wastebasket, I'm afraid. Let's look at Congress. So what is Congress doing for us? We used to have a very robust revolving fund for loans for water infrastructure, and that's been more and more defunded. And so we're not really getting much from Congress. We're getting sort of negative from Congress right now. It's getting worse. So my conclusion is that while we're thinking globally, and I know you've all thought this, we heard this, we have to act locally, right? And that means for me that we have to understand the power structure of the corporations and of Wall Street. I'm not going to get into banking here, that's other sessions here. But let's think about what's happened with the Supreme Court decisions empowering corporations. I think probably everybody's heard of Santa Clara in 1886. You're probably familiar with that. Not as many of us, and it was much later that I heard about the Dartmouth case back in 1819. This was really the first case giving corporations power. And this was Dartmouth was a private university, and the New Hampshire legislature passed a law to make it public because they thought in order to have a real democracy, you have to have good education. They wanted a public university. And the state Supreme Court upheld them in making it public. The Supreme Court did not. And what the Supreme Court says that under the Contracts Clause of the U.S. Constitution, that this was a contract between the corporation and that contract had equal standing with anything the government could do, and therefore they overturned what the New Hampshire legislature did. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's very important. It was the first time that corporations were given coverage under the Constitution in the Contracts Clause. I think it's very important that laws are action forcing and there's legal standing to enforce the laws. And so we need to have a body of laws starting from the ground up to establish the rights of self-governance and the rights of nature. So there's fundamental principles, the right to self-governance, to protect communities from corporate predation, that all government must be founded on people's authority and consent. That's what the Constitution was supposed to be about. Supposed to be. Of course, we know that Madison really wanted a monarchy, but we don't learn that in school. Inherent rights of nature. The denial of corporate constitutional rights conferred by the courts. So Santa Clara, Dartmouth, there's a whole bunch. Could spend a whole day in the Cell Democracy schools, you know, we have about all the court decisions. And finally, that the regulatory structure is set up to regulate harm. And it allows corporations to continue their profitable enterprises without really considering the harm to people and nature. So in the framing of the US Constitution, if you look through it, there's nothing about, it's all about the rights to property. There's nothing about the rights of nature in the Constitution. I was in Cochabamba, Bolivia, in a room when the resolution on the rights of nature was being discussed, with so many indigenous people who'd walked for days to be there. It was just an honor. It was just an honor to be in that room with so many people who cared that deeply that they walked for days to be in that room. I just hope that I can keep that spirit in me that I felt in that room then. So what I have done is really focus locally after doing a lot of international work on trade agreements and in this water network and everything. I got tired of going to international meetings and hearing and telling the Cochabamba story, you know, about the revolution against Bechtel and how it was successful. And I realized I was telling other people's stories, I wasn't telling my story, because I wasn't doing the work right here in the United States. And so I've been trying to do the work here in this country. And I was very inspired by going to something called a democracy school set up by the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And out of that came local ordinances by local small farming communities, Republican communities in central Pennsylvania, who said we don't want a regulatory structure to regulate the harms. We don't want corporate farming in our towns. We don't want the CAFOs. And so they started passing local laws saying there could be no corporate farming unless a member of the corporation has local dirt under their fingers. Local dirt under their fingers. I'm going to talk in a lot more detail about this later this afternoon, but just to say that I took this idea of a rights-based ordinance, and I was working on the right to water. I was doing things with Sierra Club and with the Alliance for Democracy, and I thought we need to take this concept of fundamental rights and use it for water. And so I won't get into the story here, but with some people from New Hampshire, organizers from New Hampshire, a former state legislator, we started working with the town of Barnstead, New Hampshire to create an ordinance on the right to water. And it starts out by establishing the right to local self-governance. and then the right to say corporations can't come and take our water. And then the following year, after another small rural town in Pennsylvania, Tamaqua Township, established the rights of nature in their ordinance, Barnstead then amended their ordinance, and this is in town meeting, to establish the rights of nature. It was a wonderful campaign. It's written up in an issue of Yes Magazine a few years back. And just to say that the chair of the select board fought in the Vietnam War and voted for George Bush. The local activist is a Rastafarian farmer who does biodynamic gardening. And these two people worked hand in glove in this community to pass the ordinance. And I think one of the lessons I've learned from this kind of organizing is that when you're organizing in place and people care about the place, you should not make any assumptions about where they're coming from, because you can find amazing people to work with. And when I hear people in Washington, D.C. just talking about working with progressives, they don't know. They don't know what can be done in a local community when people know and trust each other and can work together. So I'm just going to end by reading the preamble and purpose of the Barnstead ordinance that was passed in town meeting by a vote of 133 to 1. We, the people of the town of Barnstead, declare that water is essential for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, both for people and for the ecological systems which give life to all species. We, the people of the town of Barnstead, declare that we have the duty to safeguard the water, both on and beneath the earth's surface, and in the process to safeguard the rights of people within the community of Barnstead and the rights of ecosystems of which Barnstead is a part. We, the people of Barnstead, declare that all of our water is held in the public trust as a common resource to be used for the benefit of Barnstead residents and of the natural ecosystems of which they are a part. We believe the corporatization of water supplies in this community, placing the control of water in the hands of a corporate few rather than the community, would usurp democratic processes and result in tyranny. And that we, the people, are therefore duty-bound under the New Hampshire Constitution to oppose such usurpation and tyranny. The same duty requires us to recognize that 2 centuries worth of governmental conferral of constitutional powers upon corporations has deprived people of the authority to govern their own communities and requires us to take affirmative steps to remedy the usurpation of governing power. Small town in Barnstead, and we did it, and you can too. Thank you.
So I'm going to stand up so that I can see you all and so that I can throw the cameras off. I'm Carolyn Raffensperger. I'm an environmental lawyer. I work for the Science and Environmental Health Network. And I think I was put on the panel because I've been doing work that flows from a slightly different stream that comes into a confluence with the rights of nature, and that's that I've been working on the rights of future generations. I began that work through something called the precautionary principle. And I had been asked by a board member of mine, a man named Peter Montague, and many of you know Peter's work. And Peter had asked me when I started working for the Science and Environmental Health Network what the alternative decision-making structure was to risk assessment. And I had no idea. And a grad student sent me his dissertation proposal and asked to do a collaborative dissertation with me some years ago. And it was on the precautionary principle, and I instantly knew what the answer was. It was the precautionary principle. So in 1998, I convened the Wingspread Conference on the precautionary principle and went on to do some work on it. And we went to Washington, D.C. and met a man who worked for the National Institute for Environmental Health. And he says, you know, that's the first decision rule, the precautionary principle, that actually couples epistemology with ethics. And it was like, whoa, I'm an environmentalist. We've been told my entire career that we can only use science to make the decisions, right? Oh, your emotion just gets left at the door. So we weren't allowed to involve anything else. Ethics, we had no clue. So that we kind of tiptoed back out, like, what do we know about ethics? And we came to the conclusion that there are two underlying ideas about the precautionary principle that led to this deep ethic. One was to prevent harm, prevent suffering. And the other is because the precautionary principle, which says you take action to prevent harm in the face of scientific uncertainty. And we figured out how to do it. And I've given endless talks and written endlessly about how to implement the precautionary principle, not self-implementing, so you've got to have some steps to do that. And we realized that it really was future-oriented. It's to prevent harm in the future, right? Future generations. Well, all along, my wise friends at the Indigenous Environmental Network, most notably Tom Goldtooth, you know Tom? And how many of you know Tom? So Tom would stand next to me sideways with his arms folded like this, kind of lean into me, and he'd say, you know, that's the seventh generation rule.
Yeah.
And I really didn't have a clue. Partly I would calculate 7 generations, like, whoa, way too long for me to figure out. But one of his allies and colleagues, fellow employee at IEN, called me one day and he said, how do we put the precautionary principle together with the 7th generation rule to stop the Pebble mine in Alaska? And I knew instantly what an answer was, an answer. And that was to designate legal guardians for future generations who could be appointed by a tribe given their sovereignty, so that you have the tribe. Tribe's got some separate interests, right? You've got EPA, who's got some interests, and you've got the corporation. Imagine then having a guardian whose only responsibility was to speak for future generations. Imagine that. Well, that's a whole new institution. Imagine creating entirely new institutions to make decisions. Well, what would we do if we had a legal guardian? Imagine either a cabinet level office at any level of government, a legal guardian, cabinet level office, imagine Barack Obama issuing an executive order, putting into place a legal guardian for future generations. What would they do? 2 things. An audit of the commons, all these things that we share, right? These are the things that we have rights with each other to. It's not that I have a right to something, that private property language, my individual right to some kind of private property sense. We have rights with each other, and with future generations. It's not us against future generations. We're in this together. As we so inherited, may we pass on. So the first thing they would do would be an audit of the commons. How are the things that we share under that level of government? Federal government, national parks, air, water, the rivers, the Mississippi River, those shorelines and oceans. How are they? And imagine having that be reported as part of the budget by the president, because that's the real basis of our wealth. These things that we share. Now, at the same time that I've been doing all this work on future generations, oh, and let me just say the other thing that the legal guardian could do, which is to do an audit, to do an inventory and to assess the impact of all regulations for their impact on future generations. So you get a regulation under the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, or you get a regulation around mining in BLM land. The guardian would be responsible for assessing the impact of that regulation on future generations. Now, I didn't invent that idea out of thin air. Currently, we have an ombudsman for small business at the Department of Justice who reviews all regulations for their impact on small business. And you can imagine what they do to US EPA, right? That ombudsman says, you know, that's way too much paperwork. You're going to stop all business, right? Right? Isn't that what they do? Imagine having someone with that kind of power to assess the impact of regulations on future generations. We would do business differently. So now, at the same time that I've been working all this stuff out on future generations, and we went to Harvard Law School Center for International Human Rights, the Indigenous Environmental Network, and my organization, the Science and Environmental Health Network, we came out with a fabulous constitutional provision on the rights of future generations. We came out with an incredible a statute that backs it up, the constitutional provision, or it can stand alone. We came up with a job description for the legal guardian. We came up with the executive order. And I can't wait to do a certification program with other lawyers for what a guardian would actually be all about. But at the same time I was doing this work on future generations, my allies and colleagues were doing this fabulous work on the rights of nature, which comes out of a different intellectual tradition. It comes out of a lot of different strands of history. And in many ways, it came out in the United States with Tom Lindsay's work as a pushback on corporate rights. So over the last 30 years, the big emergence of rights has been corporate rights. We haven't had a big emergence of human rights or civil rights or the rights of nature or future generations. We've had this huge upwelling of rights for corporations. So this incredible work to push back on corporations really gave rise in Tom Lindsay's work to develop these ordinances, and it was to be used as a litigation strategy, right? Corporations got out of bounds, you can sue them. And I would say, in other words, I would have used a description of those them, but I can't on camera, right? I'd be censored. So the idea of the rights of nature was really used to push back in an aggressive way, in a legal way, and to begin moving rights that were not corporate rights into law. And there are other strands for both the rights of future generations and the rights of nature coming out of indigenous traditions, and we've both, all of us, referenced those. So the United Nations did come up with this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that is, I think, one of the most astonishing documents for me to read as a lawyer. And I think that it's beginning to put into place ways to put these together. And essentially, the strands of the rights of nature and the rights of future generations come together in essentially a law of community that goes beyond this individual right that I have. And we've really devolved it into property rights. You know, when I talk a lot about future generations and rights and moving environmental law out of free market private property into rights law, you know, the thing I say is you've got a greater right to own a gun than you do to own, you know, to have clean air and clean water. Now, what is that about? I happen to be a gun owner, farm in North Dakota. You know, we have skunks with rabies. So, yeah, but why should I have a greater right to own a gun than I do to have clean air and clean water? Makes no sense. In the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, they are pulling these ideas together in this broad way. The French Revolution said liberty, equality, and fraternity, sorority. Fraternity and sorority. And so I think what we're doing now is in bringing these together in such a way that we are understanding a law of community. So what are the laws of community? It's that we have an equal right and access to the commons. That corporations cannot outsource their pollution into the commons. They have to account for that. They have to pay for their costs of doing business. They can't put it out onto the commons. It gives rise to a theory of government. What's government's responsibility? Is it just to protect wealth and private property and capital? Nope. That's currently what we think it is under a utilitarian ethic. Instead, imagine that it is to protect rights, including a right to a clean and healthy environment, including the right of future generations, including the rights of nature. And imagine that it is to serve as the trustee of the commonwealth, the things that we share, the things that we share. So, the UN Declaration talks about these rights with land, with place, that tribes and indigenous peoples have with their place. What a model of an idea for us to begin to say, those fishermen in Seadrift, Texas, and the shrimpers have a right with the water, with the shrimp, to a healthy place. How different we would think about it. And a central theme in that UN Declaration, as you mentioned, is consent. Free, prior, and informed consent. Consultation is to lead to consent, and consent can be denied. But what I've been working on now has been how would we put that into place? Now, I actually think consent is the emerging right in women's issues. When we talk about a rape culture, it's because we have not fully given women the right to consent and acknowledged her right to say no or to say yes to a sexual encounter. When we talked about, and post-Nuremberg, it's after World War II where the Nazis experimented on people without their consent, where we said, you cannot be experimented on without your consent, and we still do it, right? Tuskegee, we've had endless stories of being experimented on people who are not considered equal in some way without their consent. It's a basis for science, it's a basis for medicine. No consent, you can't do it.
Informed consent.
Informed, free, prior, and informed consent. Now, imagine that we extend this to communities, as it so gracefully and elegantly describes in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. If we begin to imagine that that is a right of community, how would we do it? Well, if you go into the hospital or into a university, what happens is there's an institutional review board. And the institutional review board decides, is this experiment ethical? That's a first hurdle. It doesn't ask if it's good for the economy. It asks, is it ethical? Now, if it's a right to a clean and healthy environment, communities have rights, and we're going to give them the right to consent. We start with, is this ethical? Are tar sands ethical? Is mountaintop removal ethical in this community? And then we go to the hurdle of free, prior, and informed consent. And a community review board, instead of an institutional review board, that had that charge to decide, is it ethical? And then, do we have mechanisms for consent? Now, it happens to be in Iowa, we have a group called Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement. And I can tell you, you know when there's been no consent given to a confined animal feeding operation, because they have 100 people at the county board meeting, right? We do not consent. We withdraw our consent. A basis of governance is the consent of the governed. And when we withdraw our consent and make it clear, it cannot go forward. We withdraw our consent or we give our consent. And the basis of consultation is not just to consult and say you did it. It is to obtain consent or to accept the answer if consent has been denied. So consent, I believe, is and institutions and mechanisms for putting into place free, prior, and informed consent, I think are essential. Now, how does that tie back into the rights of nature and into the rights of future generations? Imagine that future generations and the guardian had to give consent. And imagine if the guardian was not just human, future generations was for human, but for nature. And that nature, a river, had to give its consent. Imagine, and that you are that person now charged. Can you imagine how much more satisfying it would be to be the guardian and to know that your decision is, your voice is the voice of a river, is the voice of future generations, is the voice of the monarch butterfly or the white pelican that I love so dearly in North Dakota? Imagine that. How will you speak? How will you act? Not just worried about your own Social Security, but you're worried about and giving voice. Can you withhold your consent or give your consent to the proposals in your community and neighborhood? You know, consent actually is an interesting thing. I believe that we have many avenues for that. The Royal Bank of Canada now has said that they will, as of 2010, that they will not fund projects in indigenous communities without free, prior, and informed consent. I just spoke in Geneva at the United Nations Environment Program on a big move to come up with a declaration and do some other things on the rights of future generations, and making sure that the rights of nature are folded into that so that we have this confluence and set of ideas moving together, and that consent is part of it. We will also be meeting with the World Bank to begin looking at the economic principles for making decisions and basic decision-making principles like consent. You know, I'm going to end on a slightly different note. You hear what I'm interested in. You hear how essentially we need to create new institutions, new sets of ideas. We don't have to just take US EPA or the Department of Natural Resources in some state and just keep on doing things the way we've been doing them. We can imagine new institutions. Ben Franklin created the fire department. He created the public library because they were needed at that time. We are now charged with coming up with the ways, the mechanisms, the institutions for living our lives together out of respect for the world in front of us. I came up with a new standard for law, speaking of respect, called the Respectful Person Standard. We do not have to judge our actions simply by the reasonable person standard. We can judge them by the respectful person standard. And I believe that consent and respect are parallel. You respect a person or a community enough to respect their decision if they withhold consent or if they have granted it and to seek it. But I want to end on a slightly different note. My most dearly beloveds are indigenous, tribe from this, living in the southwest of the United States. And one of the tribes that my beloveds are tribes of dreamers. And my dear friend went up to Canada to do some defense work on mining. And they were stuck because younger people wanted the elders to sell the mining rights, the mineral rights under their land. And the elders really didn't know what to do. And so a group of young men, essentially, you know, the warriors and defenders, had gone up to defend the land up just over the Canadian border. And they were stuck. I mean, the community was divided, it's poor, it's subject to everything, you know, the oh Canada, the oh shit Canada mantra. And my friend had a dream. And in the dream, I was actually a lawyer, and I told him how to have this breakfast. And he went to the women in the community, and he asked them if they would do this, if they would take the risk of following the instructions in the dream. And they did. So what they did was invited the mining company to breakfast. And imagine this is a square table. And the women had made scrambled eggs and polenta and bacon, but no toast because they didn't want to use their good jam on the mining company. And they had the children from the community sit alternating in between every mining official. And the men, you know, the 30 and 40-year-old men who are had no idea what was going to happen. They were scared. And they set off in the corner and they ate their breakfast, keeping an eye on everything. And the children had been told, there's nothing you can do that's wrong. You can't, you know, there's nothing you can say that's wrong. And they talk to them about how to have a conversation. So you can ask them about their birthday or whether they have children or what they like to do. And the kids were young, and they were spiffed up in their, you know, their best clothes and their hair cut and you know, squeaky clean. And the kids did this. And then when school was time to go to school, the kids left. And it had been a remarkable breakfast. The mining officials were charmed by these children. And then the mothers sat down where their children had been, and the grandmothers stood behind them. And then the mothers handed the mining official a picture of their child and said to them, do you choose my child to die of leukemia? Do you choose my child to have tumors on his testicle and they have him cut off and you're going to tell them why he can't have children? Do you choose my child for asthma and to live with an inhaler? Tell me now if you choose my child so I can mourn properly.
Wow.
And the mining officials wept. One resigned her job on the spot. And that afternoon, the trucks were gone.
Wow.
What those women had done was said, we do not give our consent to have our children poisoned. Is this what you are demanding? Have you taken our consent away? by choosing my child. And so I say to you, we only choose health. We only choose beauty. And to that, we give our consent. Thank you.
Montana. And if I might say this, not taking anything aside from law, what we face is a world that any law will circumvent it. It doesn't matter who you set up, they will buy them. The only way well, there are so many ways we can prevail for the earth. Our best shot, I think, was the image that you gave to us, Sherri, in the other, and that was the, I don't know if it's a legend, but you referred to the Rainbow Warriors. This is a spiritual thing, you understand. Just like this was a dream, a spiritual dream. What we have is the ability as people, millions and millions across the world, people that they can't stop. And it's the image of people of different color all over the world rising out of the ground that is us. I mean, you can appreciate how difficult it is to see in our culture a spiritual image. But this is, I think, Sherri, this is the best image that I can, if I were going as a journalist to write this story, this is it. Millions and millions and millions and millions of people that they can't stop because they can't buy us. And so, and they can't change any laws if we're confronting them and insisting on, they have to ask us. It will take our bodies, it will take us individually, it will take all of us. And so find people everywhere. That's just, I'm severely elderly at this point. Find people everywhere that can be part of these millions. And I'm personally going to individual churches in this town, and I'm talking to them, by God, to vision and to learn to pray. Again, you try to imagine how difficult it is to teach a Unitarian to pray. I mean, that is, yeah, it took me, I'm still working on it. So the Native American culture, it's prayer is part of them. So they can envision this. They can see the world, they can see the land, but holy cow, we need to relearn this. And this is just part of it. I'm just saying, because I've done this, and I've done this, and I've done this. I've been an activist all my life. By God, I'm going back, and I'm going to approach each and every church in this city, and most of them are liberal, and they should not have lost that ability to demand, not ask, but demand in prayer, that people return and be redeemed to the kind people we were intended to be.
We have a question back here and then here.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Well, I actually have sort of three questions.
Could people introduce themselves and say where they're from?
Okay, I'm Rachel Smoker. I'm with Biofuel Watch, and I live in Vermont. And I think my paths have crossed with all of the panelists here at different points, but not quite in this context. And I've been looking forward to the occasion. I have sort of three questions. One of them is, well, just to get back to what our previous commenter said, you know, I also believe that in a sense what we really, our best hope is a spiritual revolution of some sort. And that bringing these legal mechanisms that you all have been developing is a way of starting to infiltrate that into the world and into the awareness. The idea of rights of nature, for example, helps to, you know, lead to that idea of a spiritual enshrining our spiritual relationship with the earth and with each other and so on. And so that's great, but one thing that concerns me is how do these ordinances and so on stand up when they're challenged, as they will inevitably be by the powers. So that's one question I have. The other one is that I'm particularly interested to know if there are any examples of these kinds of new visions in legal mechanisms protecting non-human species. You know, we hear about the rights of nature in general. We have seen a lot of applications for water. We've seen, you know, sort of broad statements about the rights of Mother Earth, and of course that's all species. But I'm wondering if there are any examples that are really specifically used in protection of species and non-humans. The other question or thing that I'd be interested to hear more about is, what does free, prior, and informed consent mean, not just in principle, but how can we really make, you know, if I lived in that world of trying to provide scientific evidence for, you know, decision-making and policy-making, and seeing how that just goes, you know, and I think it's even harder in a lot of cases where we're, you know, working with indigenous peoples who are trying to understand, you know, from a worldview that is not theirs, you know, when people come in with, you know, their scientific, their understanding, and here's your information. Here's your information, you can now, you know, make your informed decision. So I'm wondering what kind of work is going around on really trying to make something workable as far as what.
Well, there's a lot of questions there. I can just try the first one and then people. But what happens if these local ordinances are legally challenged was the question that I heard you ask, and some of them have been. The ordinance that established the rights of nature, the third one in that part of eastern Pennsylvania, went one step further and said, if we are challenged at the state or federal level, we will have a meeting and decide what we will do. And sort of unstated is, if they are not able in the body of law at the state and federal level, that they're really considering seceding. I mean, that's really what is there. And you know, I think of Utah Phillips. I sang this once at a rally. We will not obey. It's a wonderful song. We will not obey, and the willingness not to obey the system, I think, is very important. And that just having the courage to say, if this happens, we will not obey in some manner. And that's what a lot of these ordinances is about. That's what the ordinances on local food up in Maine are about. They're saying, we will not obey these federal and state regulations that set up such rules about safe food done for by the corporations, so that we can't sell our food locally because we can't afford to meet those regulations. We will not obey. We will set up our local law that's based differently. We will not obey, and it's scary. But there were more to your question, so that was just one piece of it.
Yeah, I would like to speak to your question. I think that when we took both of your comments, actually, I think that certainly the majority of what I do is with the larger vision, you know, the physical, the spiritual, and looking at all aspects of what's going on. I just came back from Canada, actually the day before I left to come here, and we were talking about nonviolent action, about organizing against the fracking up there. We were talking about long-term strategic plans for protecting the water and the lands up there, and we did every single one of those meetings in ceremony, you know, because it's not separated. And so one of the things that that we just had in May in Canada, because Canada is a point of first contact on this continent, right in the area between Maine and Canada, and it's also the area of first blood spill in this continent. And so we had a ceremony, a convergence ceremony, where people from all different cultural backgrounds came together to acknowledge that wound and to make an intention for healing, to begin at the same point where all of the bodies began. And so, you know, all of the things that we do are connected in that way. And then we've been talking about doing a global day to have people come together from whatever background they come from, if they believe in just empathy, if they believe in energy, if they believe in God or a creator or whatever they believe in, to come together as a collective group to really envision the healing of the minds and hearts. Because we don't need to win them, we need to change them. We don't need to win their minds and hearts, we need to change their minds and hearts. And to really pray for the elevation of the consciousness of our leaders, and for the connection of their heart to creation, you know, just really working on it from every angle. I'm an attorney, you know, I work with linear thinkers all day long. But, you know, we can represent all of who we are in the work that we do. And I think that's important, and I also think it's important, you told a story about the elders really being uncertain because of the poverty, about what was the right decision to be made on this. And I think that, you know, there are Native communities that have made the decision to go with industry. And when you're weighing, you know, those types of decisions, you're really weighing the difference between spiritual poverty and material poverty. And so many tribal communities are deeply impoverished because they chose not to be spiritually impoverished. And so when you look at the reality that some of these individuals who are making these decisions within these corporations are making, they have families, they have a certain life that they've become accustomed to, they have their own fears and insecurities, they're human beings who are steeped in their own reality. It would never occur to them that it would be okay to, you know, eat commodity cheese and bologna for dinner and sleep 4 to a bed. I mean, and that's how I grew up, and that's fine, you know, that was the norm. And so their sense of poverty is at a very different place, but they're still making that same decision between spiritual poverty and material poverty. And so if we can find a way to meet them in that place and help to shift their thinking around that, then that's a clear pathway to sustainable change. And so there are groups of people in Canada and in my area that have actually made the decision that they were going to, after we had one meeting about it and talked about that, they were going to get together, and all of the women at 6 a.m. every morning were gonna have a specific type of ceremony, and the men were gonna have that same type of ceremony at 6 p.m. every night. And within a short period of time, these high-level officials suddenly said, I can't do this work anymore for Harper, and they started pulling out. And so you're every day seeing it in the paper where, you know, these things are having an impact. So it has to be a multi-tiered approach, it has to be a multi-dimensional approach, you have to be looking at it from every different perspective. And then getting to your question about the challenges to those things. I mean, the only way that we overcome those things, especially with, you know, when there's a federal law that allows for those things to happen, is to focus it on the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens from the very small local level working up, because that's the only way you override those types of, you know, broad scale federal laws that allow for some of these things to happen, to say we will not obey because we have a right under our own state sovereignty to say we will choose a different path based on the needs of the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens. And so that's really the only path to override those types of things. And so, I mean, they really need to be clearly focused on those types of things. But at the same time, we have to be willing to continue on even if they are overturned.
I will go on with a few more questions. There's a question here in the back of the room and 2 over here.
So, do I go? I'm Joan Stallard, Washington, D.C., been to democracy school, and my concentration now is to help get a constitutional amendment passed that removes the power of the corporation, the personhood, the 14th Amendment state. And I think a lot of what's happening locally, I fear, in Pennsylvania and so forth, that those laws, that those communities are threatened with bankruptcy because they're using the compensation, you know, if you can't dig this well or you can't do this fracking, then the community is then required to pay for what they, for the money lost because they were not able to do business. I mean, this abuse of the Constitution. So I feel like the multi-levels, multi-directional approach is huge. And while we work on that, I think this was very inspirational to me when you talked about the tribal communities working in the morning and the evening, because I'm just not coming from there, and I think that to concentrate. So the local communities, the national communities, and working with all the groups that are working on Monsanto and the seeds and those sorts of things, and the community organizing that's going on, permanent coalitions, all of that, we're just not going to do it unless we do come from all these multi-layers, full force. And I keep on thinking about
Everybody.
Tall skyscrapers filled with lawyers and economists paid big bucks, and that's who we fight. So I think about the tribal people coming out in the morning, and you were talking about people, coming out like they might do in France or whatever. We have, we're getting poorer and poorer here in this country, trying to put food on the table, and for how much money we spend of ours fighting the tall buildings filled with corporate people. I mean, it is more takings from us and more takings from the value of our lives, trying to put food on the table and take care of our families. So we really need to go and get more laws on our side and this multi-tiered level, because we cannot afford to be out on the street day after day after day trying to fight against the big walls of power.
I just want to jump in and say one thing. I think that if we're going to really talk about changing the laws and we want to make space for corporations to be more humane, the first one we have to look at is the one that requires them to make maximum profits. And so, there is a legal requirement for corporations to make maximum profits, which means that they send our labor away, all of the bad decisions that they make are because they're required by law to make maximum profits. So we need to change that first to give them the space to do the right thing.
There's something in here, I'm not going there, but it's called B corporation.
B corporation.
Yeah.
And it says just exactly that. There's somebody in here working on taking that bottom line away.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. There's a back here and then two over here.
I have a very specific question about consent and the right to succeed. And frankly, I got to tell you, when Margaret and Kevin called me and said, we want you to come talk at Democracy Convention, it was just a few days ago. I wasn't quite sure why. And frankly, I'm going to cry because now I know why. Mary Christine Wood at Oregon has just written a book on the public trust doctrine and applying it to the sovereign case, and I've been reading about that. I'm an isotope geochemist. I am the person that started the Boulder Municipalization Project. Wednesday night, our council put up millions of dollars to fight the corporation to make sure our right to choose an energy future worth our children inheriting actually moves forwards. We're going to be fighting Excel Energy.
Wow.
And that's why I was brought here. But very specific, and I'm just thrilled that this is all three of yours area. And I've got goosebumps galore. There's a segment of our community that Excel Energy says they own because they bought Piesco. And Piesco had been a utility for almost 100 years in Colorado. And when they bought Piesco, they bought these meters. And that all happened 40 years ago. And Piesco is saying those people have to fucking suck our coal in perpetuity. This is what they filed at the Public Utilities Commission. In perpetuity. We own them in perpetuity by right of the fact that we purchased them and their meters. And the public utilities, the Excel's running simultaneously. Excel has bought the two biggest election law Democratic lawyers in our state to run an amendment that tells the city of Boulder what their charter should say, and specifically it says you cannot bond or incur any debt or do anything without two things: having a vote of the people for every step of the way you go, and the right of us, the indigent corporation, to have a right in the vote of that city charter, and also the right of these people in Gun Barrel to vote. And yet they are not citizens of Gun Barrel, the city of Boulder. They're in the unincorporated area. So this is the public initiative that they're running, and people are like going, the right to vote on debt. Well, that makes sense. But down at the Public Utilities Commission, they have asked for a ruling that literally, that they own those people, their walls and their meters, because they bought them from Fiesco 40 years ago. And what I'm getting at is the research I've done with because I ran into Mary Christine Wood and I started learning about the public trust and applying that to the rights of nature and all of that, and being an environmental geologist. But there's this very specific case now where there's a very narrow opportunity to pull all this together and challenge it. So I'm a geologist, and I wrote the intervention that happens August 15th at the Public Utilities Commission. I don't know what I'm doing. I just know that I'm right. And I know that what you said about choice and consent and the right to succeed and the rights of nature, at this moment, at this time, I'm going to have a chance to challenge it. And I've got the full faith and backing of my community and the labs and even the chamber in my community. And I need to know exactly what I need to do.
By the way, the public trust doctrine that Mary Woods has been working on, a lot of us collaborated on a couple of projects. One is the lawsuit that kids brought called I Matter.
Yep.
On future generations, and using the public trust doctrine essentially to apply it to the sky. But there's also a very big document on the rights of future generations that Mary contributed some to, one piece to, and most of the work that I've done in the law of the commons and other things is in Vermont Law School on future generations. So, but the public trust doctrine is really one of the great gifts of the environmental movement, and what I was expressing was taking the public trust doctrine and making it a theory of government in what I said. So
I love
Maybe
it.
this is something that you could talk in more detail, because it sounds like it's a very good, very specific question, and maybe,
I'm done, yeah.
maybe you could talk together some afterwards.
love it.
I would
Sure.
like to get your email address,
Yeah.
because we have a case out of Canada that actually has a listing of 8 points of what consultation actually means and what consent means. And so we could send you the language of that, and you could, look at that and then also talk to Carolyn.
And should I go to law school, by the way?
No,
I love you
it's a
guys.
waste of
I
money.
love you guys.
Okay, there's just a minute. No.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a statement. I don't know a question really. I'm with the Public Banking Group in DC, and I tend to look more at the people at the bottom level. How do we reach them? How do we empower the most unempowered people in our communities, in our country, etc. And that one of the problems I have with the corporate world is that they've alienated us from each other, ourselves, nature, everything. We buy fashion. We buy, we're consumers. It's pathetic. It's scary and sad. I think we should have a boycott, don't buy, share, refuse to participate. But anyway, my point is that our acceptance of this corporate definition of profit over human survival has got to be challenged at its most basic level. There are tar sands boiling up, there is oil boiling up in Alberta, Canada. Right now, it has been for 9 weeks, thousands of barrels a day for every few days. 4 different bore sites, and whoever's running it is not letting the media there, and it's just ongoing. And they don't know when it's gonna stop, they don't know how to stop it, they don't know where it's coming from. That's insane. Irrelevant of the UN, and human rights and 7 generations, I look at it this way. I have a natural birthright to a livable environment, period. End of story. My grandchildren do, we all do. And somehow we have to start promoting that concept. Outside of all of these no offense, but outside of all these regulations and legalese and blah, 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 that most poor people aren't gonna be able to wrap their heads around. We can get to people by talking to them about their natural right to a life, literally. And this corporate stranglehold that we've accepted this, everyone in this room, everybody outside this room. We practice it daily. We need to stop it. We need to disengage from the idea that corporations have a right to maximize their profits at the expense of life itself on the planet. End of story.
My God, that was great.
There was a question here? Or
Oh.
did-
I think we're out of time.
we're
Do you
out.
want to say something?
Such an inspiring session. I want to
Great.
bring together emotion and spiritual and rational, the IRB thing, which I want to talk to you about. Fantastic. Great.
One thing that I want to say, and that is that my friend Diane Wilson, Unreasonable Woman for the Earth, is in our presence today. And she has done so much that bridges direct action, covers so many issues, spent enough time in jail. And to have her with us brings a kind of spirit that is a gift. So, welcome, Diane.